Okay, hey everyone, welcome back. So if it seems like I'm going at a fast clip today, because we still have a lot of systems to go through. So I'm going to try to cover the digestive system, and actually it should be digestive system and metabolism, because we want to talk about the next chapter in our book. So we got through most of the GI tract. Now let's end with the final organs. So here we have the large intestine, and we're looking at, so this is if you're looking at through somebody and you're looking at your patient. So this is the patient's anterior showing toward you. So the way I like to think about it is like the overall large intestine kind of takes this overall shape like a question mark. So again, you're looking at your patient and it kind of goes like this, starts with the cecum, then it goes up via this thing called the ascending colon. So the ascending, like going up a staircase and you ascend, or ascend in an airplane, you're going upwards. Then it takes a sharp right or right-ish turn, so like about like a 90-degree angle, and this is called a flexure over here. So then it's going to go horizontally and across. And if you remember your anatomical planes, the horizontal plane is also called the transverse plane. So this is the transverse colon. Then there's another flexure that's about a 90-degree angle, and instead of ascending, now it's going to go down and descend. And then you enter this part called the sigmoid colon. So it kind of looks like this little kind of curvy kind of like shape. And it's at sigmoid, when you think sigmoid, think S shape or curvy. Like it actually looks more like the Greek letter sigma, the lowercase version of it, but yeah, I don't expect you to know what that looks like. So when you think of sigmoid, think of S shape. That's one thing you see in like not just like anatomy, but a lot of like other type, like a sigmoid curve in statistics. They're talking about S shape curved. And then you finally end up in the rectum. So that's where we have here with the overall anatomy of the large intestines. It's kind of like question mark shape that ends with the rectum, and then that's the end of that part. Okay, so then let's talk. We did talk about different types of GI tract movement. So we talked about how the esophagus, okay, when you have that mashed up saliva and food, it's a bolus. And how do you move food through the esophagus? It's like that kind of like when you're squeezing along the length of it, like a toothpaste tube. That is peristalsis. Now, with the small intestine, it moves chyme. And how does it move it? Well, it has those like alternating contraction patterns, and eventually that kind of does like that back and forth, that kind of like salsa kind of movement, where it's mixing up the contents and also breaking up the contents and mixing up the different pockets of food, and also all the enzymes that were squared into the small intestines by the pancreas, and also the bile from the liver and gallbladder as well. And then the large intestines, there's different types of movements, but what it's going to do is move chyme that it receives from the small intestines, and then move it and then start to absorb whatever nutrients are left, and also some water as well. And then finally expel feces from the rectum. So when does chyme become feces? Well, that's a good question actually. And there was a lot of debate, like when I was doing the book writing, we were asking each other like, when is the point? So is there like a point where, okay, now it's feces? Well, when it exits your body, it's definitely feces. But think of it this way, like as it moves, it's a transitional process. It starts out as chyme, but as it transitions and ends up starts from the cecum and ends up at the rectum, it gradually becomes feces. So there's not a point where like, okay, at this point, now it's feces. Well, when it leaves you, that's definitely feces. But where does it become that? It's a big transition from the start to the end. So it's going to move via peristalsis. So you do have peristalsis in the large intestines, but you also have these special things called Hofstra contractions, and then we also have mass movements. So the thing about these mass movements, maybe you have like 2, 3, or 4 of them a day. So there's like these big movements where like parts of your large intestines are just going to move everything all at once, or but it's not like all of it. It's going to be like big sections of it, but you don't have a constant treadmill of food, digested food and waste moving through your large intestines like you have with the esophagus and the small intestines. So sometimes your large intestines is taking a break. And Hofstra contractions, they look like those little pouches. So those pouches can individually, when they get stretched out, they end up contracting. So I like to think of it like, I know this is kind of gross, but I like to think of it like, if you ever made a rice ball, or like if in like locally we call it musubi, or in Japanese, I think mainland Japan they call it onigiri, you kind of do this and kind of compact the rice like this. Well, these Hofstra contractions, there's this little pouches that kind of help to compact these the digested food as it moves through your large intestines. Because why? How do they move? Well, again, peristalsis is that very important part of movement. So no brain here, but the fecal pellet is moving by itself. But yeah, it's very slow, but does move by itself eventually. Oh yeah, there it is. So what I'm getting at here is that your intestines are able to contract on their own without needing your brain to intervene. So this is how we're able to kind of move things without really thinking about that. Really interesting experiment. And why did they do that? Well, they're going to like treat these different intestines with like different drugs that may affect intestinal movement, and they can see whether that fecal pellet moves faster or slower. There's a reason why there's a ruler there. But back to the topic at hand. So what does the large intestine do? Well, one thing is that you want to reabsorb like the leftover water, and actually your small intestines actually does the most of the absorption of water from your digested food and drink. But the large intestine finishes the job. So there's still a significant amount of water left in your large intestines, but you don't want to absorb all of the water, because otherwise you'll be passing a brick once it comes out of your rectum. And if you've ever, would you want a really hard and dry feces coming out of your rectum? Probably not. So it's important to reabsorb a lot of water, but not so much that the feces becomes hard and dry. So because that sounds very painful. And also feces compaction. So now that you've absorbed most of the nutrients in the small intestines, now you can start to press it together, because it's harder to absorb something and get nutrients from something that's hard and dense versus all that chyme that's very liquidy and soupy and passing through your small intestines. But now that you've absorbed most of those nutrients, now you can kind of compact the waste so you're not passing a huge volume of feces. And also storage of fecal matter. So imagine if your GI tract was a non-stop process. So once you get something in your mouth and you start to swallow it, then you have to time it and like, oh shoot, yeah, eventually it's going to come out like at this time. Thankfully, your large intestines can store things so that when it's safe to go, or when it's time to go and you have too much in your large intestines, then you can evacuate and defecate. And the large intestine does also not only absorbs water, but also vitamins. So there are some vitamins that are produced by the native bacteria in your large intestines. So it's even though most of the nutrient and vitamin absorption is in the small intestines, there's still some absorption left to do in the large intestine. So let's talk about those bacteria, or these gut flora. And this is also why the ileum of the small intestine has a lot of lymphoid tissue, because if this flora ends up back in your small intestines, then this kind of bacteria can worm its way back up your GI tract. But in the large intestines, it's okay to have this these gut flora. And this is why, so gut flora and these bacteria, this is about, well, depends on the study, but it makes up a significant, not the majority, but it makes about maybe like 30 to 50% of solid feces. So I don't expect you to know the exact number. Just know that the part of your feces is not necessarily digested food, but also bacterial. So, and then there are trillions in the gut. And yeah, 40 to 50 trillion bacteria in your body. So this is why, like, I mean, I think I've seen like some articles that say that you are mostly bacteria. And if you talk about individual cell count, yeah, the bacteria cells in our large intestine outnumber our own individual eukaryotic cells. But our cells are much bigger. So I think that's kind of like being a little dishonest or sensationalist. So again, like most of our volume is our own cells, but yes, if you talk about cell count, there are more bacteria, but it's also because bacterial cells are way smaller than our cells on average. And they are an innate defense, because there are sometimes pathogenic disease-causing bacteria that can infect your gut and then cause all these problems, because these are they're like bad house guests. They come in, they eat your food, and they leave their waste everywhere and make your life a living hell. So that's what like pathogenic bacteria are, like Clostridium difficile or C. diff. That is like a type of bacteria that can cause all these GI problems, because they multiply and they crowd out your good bacteria, and they just make things, and this is why sometimes they have to like treat with antibiotics. Or an interesting thing is that it's getting more popular, is what they call a fecal transplant. So they literally take someone else's feces and then use the bacteria from that feces to colonize and restore the balance of somebody who is experiencing a C. diff infection. But is it like the standard treatment? Depends on the doctor and clinic, but it is an option. Okay, so why is gut flora important? Not only to protect, but also to ferment and so you still have some nutrients left over. So things like short chain fatty acids, they can take whatever lipids or fatty acids are left over and digest them further. And then your large intestines can absorb these short chain fatty acids. But your gut flora also produce vitamins. So sometimes you can get these, they take the nutrients from your food and then they convert it into forms that you can absorb in your large intestine. So examples of this are vitamin B5 and also vitamin B7, aka biotin. And there's also vitamin K, which is actually a group of chemical compounds. But yeah, vitamin K, if you remember the coagulation and the clotting lectures I had earlier in the semester, that is one that's produced by fermentation, including the fermentation that occurs in your gut. So here's the large intestines, and yeah, and actually this part right here, cecum here, I didn't mention the appendix. So the appendix is they thought it was okay, something left over from evolution, but now they're thinking oh, maybe this is actually a good reservoir of your normal gut flora. So say you take antibiotics or you have an episode of diarrhea, what's that going to do? That's going to flush all the bacteria out of your large intestine. So they thought maybe this is kind of like a storehouse, in case something happens to all the gut bacteria here, then all the bacteria stored in your appendix can repopulate and restore the gut flora that were originally there. But is it necessary? No. Again, so sometimes that part gets inflamed, and the thing is, this is why if you have an inflamed appendix, you don't want to wait too long, because I had one, and then luckily I caught it in time before it perforated, in other words gets a hole, or ruptures, which means it bursts. And that is scary because why? Well, that means all the bacteria would be released from your gut into your abdominal cavity and all the tissues and your bacteria there. This is why sometimes good bacteria and bacteria is kind of inexact terms, because they're good as long as they stay in the place they're supposed to be. If these bacteria end up in the rest of your tissues surrounding your large intestines, that is going to wreak havoc on your immune system and possibly cause sepsis and cause death. So that's why good bacteria are good if they stay where they're supposed to be. All right, so that's why if you feel that kind of that pain down there, and the way it felt for me is I knew it wasn't constipation, but I knew it wasn't stomach problems because it was too low. So then I was okay, maybe I should get this checked out. And then I think the PA actually diagnosed me. They did they tried to check for tenderness in my abdomen, and they also did a blood test, and then my white blood cell count was super high, and she's you need a scan. And I'm okay. So I had to go get a scan, and then my appendix was the diameter was huge. Luckily it was intact, so they removed it. I was out, I had a surgery, and then I slept overnight in the hospital, and I was discharged the next day. If it had burst, that means they would have to basically clean, if your appendix bursts or ruptures or has a perforation, that means you're in the hospital for at least a week. And they're going to pump you full of antibiotics because they don't want those bacteria causing sepsis and infecting the rest of your body. And yeah, maybe 1 or 2 weeks. So you're going to have antibiotics given to you constantly through IV, and they actually have to clean out all the contents, all the feces and bacteria and undigested food that's spilled out from your large intestines, and clean that out from your abdominal cavity. So that's why it's important to detect it early, and that's why sometimes people who ignore it can die from appendicitis. But back to our story. Now we're highlighting the rectum. So the rectum, final stop. This is before you expel feces out into the surrounding areas. Okay, so what is the rectum? Well, you actually have these little columns right here and this canal over here, and then you have this ring of muscles called the anus. So the anus has, and just before you get to the anus, you have the anus is the entrance or the exit out into the environment. And then before that, you have 2 rings of muscles called the anal sphincters. So there's an internal one and there's an external one. So one's more inner, one is more toward the outside. Now these sphincters are rings of muscles, and then when they contract, what are they going to do? they're going to squeeze this opening so that feces doesn't get expelled. But when you defecate and release feces, then they have to relax and allow feces to go out into the environment. You should watch her video. I think she does a great job of making it entertaining, and it's very digestible, pun not intended, to talk about feces and defecation. But what's the whole part of this? Well, the thing is that you have those two anal sphincters, and the internal anal sphincter is made out of smooth muscle. Why is that important? Well, smooth muscle is not under voluntary control, so you can't tell it to contract or not. It is controlled by parasympathetic nerve fibers from your autonomic nervous system, and again, if you forgot what that is, go back to my previous lectures about that. But what happens is that these are the internal anal sphincter is, how do you relax it? It's triggered by stretching, and this is something Dr. Enders talks about in her talk too, is that when there's something there, that's going to stretch this surrounding area. So there's a reflex that happens that if you stretch this part right here, then it's going to relax this internal anal sphincter and allow the contents to move to the next stop. But thankfully you have the external anal sphincter, because again, do you want anything that just ends up there being released without you controlling it? So you want control at the last minute. So you have the external anal sphincter, and even though we talk about a skeletal muscle, is this like anchored to a bone like a typical joint? No, this is talking about skeletal muscle in terms of being innervated by nerve fibers, so that you have voluntary control. So you want control of this because again, even though this part right here is involuntary and just goes on to the external anal sphincter, when it's there, that sends the alarm signals like, hey, you have something coming down the chute. You better get to a bathroom quick because this stuff is here, it's ready. So this is why it's good to have a voluntary external anal sphincter so that you can get to safety and then you defecate where you need to. You can defecate safely and where it's sanitary. Now, what happens? So what is to show to put this together? What we have here is feces. That's going to stretch this area. The internal sphincter, because it's involuntary and controlled by reflexes, is just going to relax and let it go on to the next step. And the external anal sphincter, say you're now in the restroom and on the toilet, now you can finally relax this sphincter and release feces and defecate. So that's how you put those two together, and it's kind of like a double seal, so like a double Ziploc bag. It's not just one seal, you have two seals that keep the contents in you, and then you can open it when you need it. Now, what would say for some reason, and why do I make such big deal that the internal is smooth muscle and the external is striated muscle, striated voluntary muscle? But say you switched it around. Well, okay, let's switch this around in the theoretical person, and now we have voluntary control of our internal anal sphincter, but the external anal sphincter is not under voluntary control. So say we detect something here and we let it go, and we're like, okay, let's relax this internal anal sphincter. So we have this here, but if this was under the external anal sphincter was not under voluntary control, as soon as something hits this area between the internal and external, it will release, theoretically in this example. So say you did relax your internal anal sphincter and there was something left over here. Well, the external anal sphincter is going to detect something there, so you would not have control of anything that ends up between the two anal sphincters. So it's good that we do have control at the last minute, because why? You want that control, and this is why we're able to hold it in when we feel something in this area. So we're like, okay, pressure's building up, we got to get to the bathroom. So that's why it's important to get that external anal, that external anal sphincter has voluntary control. Yeah, and okay, so now we're defecating, or actually like, okay, defecation happens, and let's talk about feces real quick. So why is poop brown? Why is feces brown? Well, why is it typical color? Well, it deals with all the way back to the blood chapter and hematology, where we talked about how red blood cells are recycled. So remember that red blood cells, they contain a lot of hemoglobin, and each hemoglobin molecule has 4 heme molecules in its structure. So what happens to heme? Well, the iron is recycled from heme, but heme itself is a waste byproduct. So heme is going to be metabolized into biliverdin, which is green, and then biliverdin gets metabolized into bilirubin. And then from bilirubin, where does that end up? So now bilirubin is actually going to go to the liver, and the liver, which makes bile, so it's all coming together and it's all looping on each other. So the liver is going to excrete bilirubin into bile. So bile is going to carry bilirubin into the intestines, and then bilirubin is going to be converted into urobilin and stercobilin. So uro sounds like urine, right? So that's where this urobilin ends up. This urobilin ends up being absorbed back into your bloodstream, where it ends up at the kidneys. And this is also why it's sometimes called urochrome, because urobilin, when it's excreted, ends up is the color that gives urine its typical yellow color. Now sterco is rare but useful. Whenever you see sterco, that means we're related to feces. So stercobilin is going to end up in feces, and stercobilin is a brown color. So that's why the normal color of feces is brown, due to all the stercobilin. Just like as normal color of urine is yellow, stercobilin is normally brown. And it's all due to those heme pigments just going heme being metabolized via two different chemical pathways. Now, what if it's not that color? Say if you have like green feces. Well, this is often due to diet. So what can happen is it could be due to bile, something wrong with the bile or fat or some sort of like metabolism. But often with green feces, it might be due to eating a lot of dark leafy greens. It might be due to bile, but if it's a constant thing, yeah, like if you eat a lot of salad for like a day or two and then you have dark green feces, then I'm like, oh, okay, maybe I'll hold off or go easy instead of going full ham on a head of lettuce or something. But if it's constantly green, then you might want to get that checked and make an appointment with some internal medicine. So green, yeah, often due to diet, sometimes with bile, but yeah. But another thing, this is crazy, like, when was this? Back in 2015. So food dyes can also cause green feces as well. So there was something like, I never got to try this, and I think it's too much. I don't think even going to show it on YouTube for educational purposes. People have taken pictures of how it looked, and it's pretty like, yeah, I don't think I can show that without getting some sort of like strike on that. But yeah, food dye can also cause green feces due to metabolizing that dye and then separating the dye pigments. Now what we have here is a pale, and sometimes it's called a clay-colored or cream-colored feces. And what might that indicate? Well, when it's that color, that is the color feces would be without stercobilin. So stercobilin, again, is the pigment that makes our poop normally brown. So what could cause a lack of stercobilin in our feces? So again, now you have to go backwards, and this is why I bring up that heme metabolism or metabolic pathway so much. Because if you go backwards, again, that stercobilin comes from bilirubin, and bilirubin was secreted by the liver into bile. But say something blocks the bile duct, or there you have a liver disease like cirrhosis or hepatitis, that is going to cause the liver to not produce enough bile. And what happens to bilirubin? Well, if you can't produce bile, how are you going to get rid of bilirubin? So it's still in your body, so what's going to happen to this bilirubin that accumulates? Then if you go all the way back to like the spleen and whatnot, it's going to be circulating in your bloodstream. So this bilirubin ends up in your bloodstream, and then this is why liver disease often causes jaundice. But again, if you have that blockage, no bilirubin in the intestines means no stercobilin. No stercobilin means lack of brown pigment in your feces. So if you have a lack of stercobilin, this is why liver disease can cause pale colored stools, because something is wrong with either the liver itself or the production or excretion of bile into the intestines. So that's why if you see pale colored stools, definitely you should get a checkup as to why this. And there are colors, you can find photos of this online, but I think, again, putting pictures of feces on YouTube, I'm pretty sure that violates their terms of service. So pale clay colored, yeah, liver disease, bile production, and sometimes if you eat a lot of fatty foods, like I don't know how much fat you need to get like pale yellow fatty stools, but that can also be a nutritional cause of pale stools. But yeah, you should get checked either way. And then how about this color? So this is a bright red color. So red could be fresh blood, so again, like blood is red, but something else can cause red stools. Like this is anecdotal, like the red velvet cupcakes with all the red dye, that can cause that. And actually, and I didn't get to try these either, but yeah, supposedly that I don't know if they're going to release this again, but food dyes can cause abnormal feces color. And how about this? Like this is very interesting. I think back in 2012. If you like hot chip and whatnot, Flaming Hot Cheetos, those are, I mean, I think almost every year students have told me that Flaming Hot Cheetos causes red feces or when they go to the bathroom. So this led to a lot of emergency room visits because it was turning people's feces and poop red. So people thought, like, oh my god, I'm bleeding out. And they don't realize, like, oh yeah, I actually ate a whole bag of Flaming Hot Cheetos earlier today. But yeah, spicy, lots of red food dye, red velvet cupcakes, and then Flaming Hot Cheetos, or anything that has a lot of red food dye can also cause your feces to turn red. So whatever doesn't get absorbed by your body ends up being passed somehow, and if it's like something like food dye, probably in the feces. Alright, so it can be food coloring, but it can also be, yeah, do beets make feces red or just urine red? That's a good question. I've heard of beets making urine red, but I've never eaten like so much beets that it would actually turn it pinkish color. But I would imagine, because I think Red Velvet used to use beets as coloring before red food dye, because, and I think, I've never made it, but I heard like Red Velvet cupcakes have crazy, like, hella, like you have to pretty much use the whole like bottle of red food dye, so it's no wonder that causes that effect. I guess because also you have that chocolate in there, and they have to dye that chocolate so much that with so much red dye that it overwhelms the brown color of chocolate and makes it red. I guess that's why that red food dye also overwhelms the brown stercobilin color as well. Yeah, I never eaten that many beets, so I'll take your word for that. Okay, so can it be blood? Sometimes. So if it's like very fresh blood, and people who have hemorrhoids, they sometimes have red stools because that is like hemorrhoids in the rectum would release blood just before you exit the feces. So when you expel the feces and defecate, the blood comes along with it. So the possible rectal bleeding if fresh. So if it's kind of red and glistening, it might be blood. But someone's actually pointing out it might be blood if it's black. So black feces is something a little more concerning because blood clots and it eventually turns darker in color. So black also is an indication of iron as well. A lot of iron in blood. So black stools, or sometimes they call it tarry stools, like tar in the road. So possible blood in the upper GI, especially things like ulcers, and if the ulcer starts bleeding as it makes its way from the stomach or duodenum all the way through the small intestines and large intestines, by the time that it spends from that area in the middle of your GI tract, and then, or maybe if you have esophageal bleeding as well, it takes time to go all the way through your GI tract, and by the time it ends up in your feces, then you have all this like release of iron. So iron supplements can also cause black stools. So if you're eating too much iron supplements, and that may also cause black stools. And then licorice, I mean, I don't like licorice. Sorry if you like it, but I guess that can also cause black stools as well. So there are many things that can cause that, but if it's not iron, you're not having high iron intake or eating a bunch of black jelly beans, you might want to get it checked out.